At 4 in the morning, the logging camp looked dead. Snow covered the roofs. The horses stood breathing clouds into the dark. Inside the bunkhouse, 100 exhausted men were still asleep in rows of straw-filled bunks. But across the yard, one building was already roaring awake, the cookhouse. Before a single axe struck timber, the cook had to turn sacks of flour, barrels of pork, frozen beef, potatoes, beans, and dried fruit into enough food to move an army through the woods. And he had to do it again at noon, then again at night. We have the figures from one New Hampshire camp in 1918. For 100 men, cook Dan Kelleher could go through 75 to 100 pounds of beef in a day, 3 bushels of potatoes, 30 pies, 16 to 20 double loaves of bread, and 200 doughnuts. That was not a holiday feast. That was the daily machinery of camp life. People like to picture one old cook casually flipping pancakes over a wood stove. That is not what happened. A serious winter cookhouse was a food factory without electricity, gas burners, refrigeration, mixers, thermostats, or delivery trucks waiting at the door. If the sleigh carrying provisions failed to arrive, the cook could not open an app and order another barrel of flour. If the fire cooled, breakfast stopped. If breakfast stopped, the logging operation stopped with it. And about those 500 pancakes painted on the board, no trustworthy ledger tells us that every 100-man camp produced exactly 500 each morning. Some breakfasts were pancakes. Some were oatmeal, hash, codfish cakes, fried mush, bread, doughnuts, or all of them together. But pancakes were common. Appetites were enormous, and cookhouses fed as many as 500 men 3 or 4 times a day. The unbelievable scale is real. The secret was not one recipe, it was a system. These are 25 forgotten logging camp cooking tricks that fed crews in deep winter, beginning with the small habits that saved minutes and ending with the rule that gave one cook more authority than nearly any man in camp. Number 25. The cook started tomorrow's breakfast tonight. The first trick was to stop thinking of breakfast as a morning job. When supper ended, the cookhouse did not shut down. Beans could be sorted and soaked. Flour could be measured. Dried fruit could be set in water to swell. Bread dough could begin working while the men slept. Meat for the morning could be moved to the safest place to soften enough for the knife. Potatoes left from supper could become breakfast hash instead of returning to a cold storeroom. That mattered because sunrise was not the deadline. The men often left before full daylight. A cook who waited until morning to begin was already late. Number 24. The fire was treated like another employee. So the cookhouse fire had to be managed as carefully as the crew. The bull cook or cookie kept dry fuel close, split pieces by size, and learned which wood produced quick flame and which held a bed of coals. Thin pieces woke the range. Heavier wood carried it through a long bake. Embers left from the night shortened the climb to breakfast heat. The cook did not merely ask, "Is the stove hot?" He needed different heat in different places at the same time. Boiling water wanted direct heat. A pot of oatmeal wanted a gentler place where it would not scorch. Bread needed a steady oven. Pancakes needed a griddle hot enough to brown batter without burning the first side before the center set. Number 23. One cook did not feed 100 men alone. The legend remembers the cook. The cookhouse survived because of the crew behind him. Large camps employed cookies, assistant cooks and flunkies who carried food, set tables, washed dishes, and kept the dining room moving. A flunky might wait on as many as 40 loggers. Bull cooks cut firewood, hauled water, and maintained the premises. In the largest operations, the head cook was less like a man making breakfast at home and more like the foreman of a compact factory. That division of labor prevented skilled hands from being wasted. The head cook seasoned the beans, judged the bread, cut the meat, and controlled timing. A helper peeled potatoes. Another managed the fire. Another filled syrup, bread, and coffee along the tables. Nobody stopped the griddle to look for wood. Nobody abandoned the oven to fetch water. It sounds obvious now, but isolation made every missing task dangerous. Forget one bucket, and the dishes backed up. Let the wood box empty, and 3 meals slowed. Fail to set the tables before the bell, and men crowded the doorway while food cooled. Number 22. The kitchen was arranged by movement, not appearance. There was no room for a cook to walk a pretty circle around his kitchen 500 times. Flour belonged near the mixing bench. Water, fat, salt, and leavening had to be within a few steps. Finished bread needed a protected rack. Dirty pans moved away from clean ones. Fuel entered without passing through the serving line. The shortest path mattered because one unnecessary journey repeated all morning became miles of wasted motion by the end of a season. The same logic shaped the work. Potatoes were peeled in batches, not one pot at a time. Loaves were formed together. Pie shells were rolled in a run. Doughnuts were cut while fat heated. The cook tried to finish one kind of motion before beginning another. When every shelf, knife, and bucket had a place, the cook could work in weak lamplight, with steam against the windows, and 3 men asking questions without losing the sequence in his head. Number 21. Batter changed, but the griddle kept moving. Pancakes were not one fixed recipe in the woods. Surviving logging camp menus list cornmeal pancakes, rice pancakes, and buckwheat pancakes. Leftover cooked grain could be folded into a new breakfast. Different flours and meals gave variety while using what the commissary had in quantity. The real trick was continuity. Batter had to be loose enough to spread quickly, but thick enough to turn without tearing. The griddle was greased lightly and repeatedly. A cook learned the pattern of his iron, so one row could be poured while another row was turned and a third came off. He did not stare at a clock. The surface told him when to move. Bubbles opening, edges losing their wet shine, the smell shifting from raw flour to toasted grain. Every wasted second multiplied across hundreds of cakes. And the pancakes could not wait long. A mountain of cold flapjacks was not success. Helpers moved them from iron to table in waves, while syrup and butter were already in place. The point was not to finish all 500 before anyone ate. It was to create an uninterrupted river of hot food until the last table was fed. Number 20. Syrup came by the barrel for a reason. When a camp ordered pancake syrup, a bottle would have been a joke. Forest History Society records describe syrup for 100-man operations arriving in barrels. Bulk syrup solved 3 problems at once. It stored a large amount of quick energy without spoiling easily. It improved plain cornmeal, oatmeal, fried mush, biscuits, and pancakes. And it let the cook turn inexpensive grain into food men actually wanted to eat. But a barrel created its own problem. Put it on every table and the dining room became sticky chaos. So syrup was transferred into manageable pitchers or cans before the bell. Helpers could refill those vessels without dragging the entire supply through the room. Molasses performed similar work. It sweetened beans, cookies, gingerbread, and puddings, and supplied strong flavor from a shelf-stable container. Dried apples and ordinary pie filling tasted richer with it. In a winter camp, sweetness was not merely a treat. Fast-digested carbohydrate offered tired men immediate fuel, while fat and protein carried them longer. Number 19. Yesterday's potatoes became today's hash. 3 bushels of potatoes a day could not be treated like 3 precious potatoes in a home kitchen. The camp answer was to cook with the next meal already in mind. Boiled or baked potatoes served at supper could be cooled, chopped, and browned for breakfast. Small pieces and broken potatoes disappeared into hash, stew, soup, or fish cakes. Peelings stayed thin because waste multiplied at camp scale. Surviving menus even specify hashed brown potatoes cooked in the oven. That detail matters. Frying every piece on the stovetop would occupy scarce iron and demand constant turning. Spreading potatoes in pans let the oven brown a large batch, while the range top handled coffee, meat, mush, and pancakes. Hash was more than a leftover dish. It was a scheduling tool. Meat trimmings, onions, and potatoes could be combined in one pan, held hot, and portioned quickly. The cook gained a filling food that did not need to be made from zero during the breakfast rush. Number 18. Mush did the work while the cook did something else. Oatmeal, cornmeal, mush, hominy, rice, and other hot cereals appear again and again in camp menus because they solved a difficult problem. How do you put warm food into 100 men without occupying 100 square feet of griddle? A large kettle could cook many portions at once. Once the grain was incorporated and the heat controlled, it demanded less frantic handling than individual pancakes or chops. The cook could move to bread, potatoes, or meat while a helper watched the pot. The placement on the stove was the trick. Too much direct heat scorched the bottom before the top thickened. Too little produced gluey grain and a late breakfast. Experienced cooks brought liquid to heat, added grain carefully to prevent lumps, then shifted the kettle toward a slower part of the range. And any firm leftover mush was not dead food. It could be cut into slices and fried the next morning, then served with syrup. The same grain appeared once soft and steaming, then again browned and crisp. That stretched variety without demanding a completely different inventory. Number 17. Preserved meat was a clock the cook could trust. Fresh beef, pork, and eggs reached many well-supplied camps, especially as roads, rail lines, and company farms improved. But the older foundation remained food that could survive distance. Salt pork, corned or pickled beef, ham, bacon, sausage, and dried codfish. Preserved meat gave the cook something priceless predictability. A storm could stop a sleigh, deep cold could freeze fresh meat into a block. Salted and smoked stores bought time when the supply line failed. The trick was removing enough salt and toughness without throwing away flavor. Meat could be soaked, simmered, or combined with potatoes, beans, and gravy. Salt pork supplied fat to a pan that would later brown onions or potatoes. Codfish joined potato to become breakfast cakes. Tough cuts went into long, wet cooking where time did what a tenderloin did not require. The cook was not disguising inferior food. He was matching each preservation method to a cooking method. Quick heat for bacon, slow heat for salt beef, moist heat for stew, chopping for hash. Number 16. Dried fruit was made to drink again. Fresh fruit in a remote winter camp was valuable and often difficult to supply. Dried apples, prunes, currants, raisins, figs, and apricots traveled better and waited patiently in storage. But they were not always served dry from a sack. The cook returned their water. Soaking and stewing enlarged the fruit, softened it, and created a sweet liquid that could be served with breakfast or worked into pudding and pie. Dried apples became filling. Prunes became sauce. Currants and raisins gave plain dough, something men remembered. The process also rewarded planning. Fruit set to soak the night before required less fuel and less aggressive boiling in the morning. A slow pot at the side of the stove could work while the cook handled urgent food. This was one reason pie became such a camp obsession. Flour, fat, sweetener, and dried fruit were durable supplies. Combined skillfully, they tasted nothing like emergency rations. A 30-pie day was possible because filling could be prepared in bulk, crust rolled in a sequence, and identical tins sent through a steady oven. Number 15. Root cellar food was rotated, not merely stored. Potatoes, onions, turnips, rutabagas, carrots, cabbage, and beets were camp workhorses. They kept better than delicate vegetables, carried well in sacks or barrels, and could enter breakfast, dinner, or supper without looking exactly the same. But cold alone did not protect them. Freeze a potato solid, and its texture could be ruined. Keep vegetables too warm or damp, and rot traveled through the pile. The oldest bruised or softening stock had to be used first. Good food was separated from decay before one bad piece spoiled its neighbors. The menu followed the storeroom. Cabbage beginning to tire could become soup, slaw, or a boiled side. Turnips and onions strengthened stew. Potatoes thickened chowder, covered meat pie, or filled hash. The cook did not decide every meal from desire. He looked at what would be lost next. That quiet rotation prevented a disaster more serious than an ugly carrot. 100 men could consume a week's vegetables with shocking speed. If the cook discovered half the store spoiled after a storm closed the road, there was no easy replacement. Number 14. The oven was never allowed to do one job. A hot oven represented chopped wood, hauled wood, kindling, draft, and time. Using it for one pan was throwing labor up the chimney. So the cook thought in loads. Bread might occupy the reliable center. Pies could follow as the temperature shifted. Cookies, biscuits, or doughnuts required different handling, but their preparation was arranged so the next batch was ready when space opened. Potatoes could bake around other work. Puddings used the remaining heat. The cook also learned how his oven lied. A black iron range might be hotter at the firebox side and cooler near the door. Pans were turned or exchanged before one row burned and another remained pale. The nose often detected trouble before the eye could see it. In Dan Kelleher's 100-man camp, the daily count included 16 to 20 double loaves, 30 pies, and 200 doughnuts. Whether every item entered the same oven is not the point. The scale demanded a baking schedule as disciplined as a train timetable. Number 13. Yeast was kept on a daily rhythm. That same New Hampshire record says 10 yeast cakes could be used in a day. At that scale, bread was not an occasional project. It was a living production line. Yeast worked according to warmth, time, and the condition of the dough, not the cook's orders. A winter kitchen could be hot beside the range and cold enough to stall fermentation only a few feet away. Dough needed a protected place warm enough to rise, but not so hot that it raced ahead or formed a dry skin. The cook learned to read volume and touch. A schedule helped, but dough made the final decision. Mix too late, and bread missed the meal. Mix too early, and it overproofed while the oven was occupied. Shape loaves unevenly, and the small ones dried before the large ones baked through. This is why repeated daily baking created its own advantage. The cook knew his flour, water, room, and stove. He adjusted by feel long before a written recipe could explain what had changed. Number 12. Fat was an ingredient, a tool, and a fuel saver. Lard, bacon grease, salt pork fat, and butter carried calories, but in the cookhouse they also made iron usable. A lightly greased griddle released pancakes. Fat in a roasting pan prevented sticking and helped potatoes brown. A spoonful carried onion flavor through hash or stew. Rich dough stayed tender longer than lean dough. And a cook who rendered usable fat from meat did not have to open a fresh container for every pan. The skill was control. Too little and food welded itself to iron, too much, and pancakes became heavy. Smoke filled the room and precious stores disappeared. Old ranges had no exhaust hood to hide mistakes. A smoking griddle announced poor heat or careless greasing to the whole building. The cook also separated clean, reusable fat from scorched residue. Grease carrying burnt flour could ruin the next batch. Good fat was strained, covered, and kept away from dirt. Number 11. Beans were cooked with time instead of attention. Beans, pork, and bread formed the old trinity of early logging camp food. The reason was not mystery. Dry beans were compact, inexpensive, durable, and capable of feeding a crowd. But they punished a cook who rushed them. Soaking shortened the cook and helped the beans soften evenly. Gentle, long heat let salt, pork, molasses, and seasoning move through the pot. Fierce boiling split the skins and could leave hard centers while the outside collapsed. The best place was not always directly above the hottest flame. It was where the pot could continue for hours without demanding a man beside it. That made beans compatible with the camp schedule. While they cooked, hands were free to knead bread, cut potatoes, and fill pies. A large pot could serve at more than one meal or become the foundation of soup. Beans were also a test. Historical accounts say the men knew immediately whether they had been seasoned properly. They might accept familiar simplicity, but they did not accept carelessness. Number 10. The cook built variety from the same supplies. A remote camp could not stock a city market, yet men doing brutal work would leave a camp over monotonous or badly prepared food. The cook solved that conflict by changing form more often than inventory. Cornmeal appeared as soft mush, fried slices, pancakes, muffins, cornbread, or pudding. Potatoes were boiled, mashed, baked, creamed, browned, scalloped, or mixed into hash and chowder. Beef became roast, stew, meat pie, soup, gravy, or cold cuts. Dried fruit became sauce, jam, pie, and pudding. The ingredients repeated. The experience did not. Historical menus show this deliberately. One breakfast offered oatmeal, rye bread, cornbread, syrup, doughnuts, apple butter, creamed potatoes, coffee, and codfish cakes. Another used boiled rice, oatmeal, cornmeal, pancakes, molasses cookies, hash browns, and liver with onions. These were not delicate meals, but they were not the same plate every morning. Number 9. Food for the woods was chosen to survive the journey. If men worked more than about a mile from the cookhouse, historical accounts say the noon meal could be hauled out to them. Later camps prepared box lunches. Either way, food had to survive cold, vibration, delay, and rough handling. A beautiful meal that spilled from the sleigh was not useful. Stew, beans, soup, sandwiches, bread, pie, cookies, and donuts traveled because they could be portioned, covered, and eaten with limited equipment. Hot food went into substantial containers, wrapped and moved at the last practical moment. Coffee or tea needed lids that stayed on over a rutted trail. The menu worked backward from distance. A crew close to camp could receive food that demanded quick service. A distant crew needed something forgiving. Thick stew held heat better than a thin sauce. Bread and pastry did not become inedible the moment they cooled. A meat pie carried starch, fat, and protein in one piece. The cook was feeding men he might not see at noon. He had to imagine the temperature of the food after the sled ride, not only when it left his stove. Number 8. The dinner sled was a moving cookhouse. Delivery was not the end of cooking. It was the last stage. A cookie, taking dinner into the cut, carried more than a pot. He carried the camp's schedule. Leave too early, and the food waited in the cold. Leave too late, and axes stopped while men stood hungry. Lose the trail or spill a container, and there was no second lunch hidden behind the next tree. In the hardest weather, the serving place mattered. Men needed a spot out of direct wind when possible. A small warming fire might be prepared where conditions and rules allowed. Food was opened only when the crew arrived, so steam stayed trapped. Portions moved quickly because every lifted lid released heat. Then the containers, dishes, and scraps came back. The cookhouse needed them cleaned and ready while supper was already underway. This is why a camp meal was not merely a recipe. It was logistics measured in miles, snow depth, horses, lids, blankets, buckets, and minutes. The cook's authority had to extend beyond his door, because one careless ride could undo 4 hours of kitchen work. Number 7. Tables were loaded before the men entered. Imagine 100 men walking into a room at the same moment, each able to eat faster than the kitchen could cook his replacement plate. The answer was not to take 100 orders. Food was served family style. Bread, meat, potatoes, beans, syrup, and drink were positioned along long tables so many hands could reach them at once. Flunkies watched levels and replaced dishes before they were empty. The men sat in expected places, and the flow of food followed a familiar route. The table itself became a distribution machine. This reduced the distance between kitchen and stomach. Instead of plating one meal at a time, the cook released food in vessels holding many portions. Instead of every man crossing the room, dishes traveled a short line of hands. Instead of asking what each logger wanted, the camp had already decided the meal. The arrangement also revealed shortages quickly. A weak point appeared as an empty platter at one table, not as 100 separate complaints. A good flunky moved before the men needed to call him. Speed began before the door opened. Number 6. The no-talking rule made 8-minute meals possible. One of the strangest logging camp customs was silence at the table. Men spoke only for practical reasons, pass the meat, or shoot the beans. To an outsider, it could look like extraordinary politeness. It was closer to controlled urgency. Forest History Society accounts describe meals consumed in roughly 8 minutes. Silence kept 100 exhausted men from turning breakfast into a meeting. They ate, the tables cleared, and the cookhouse reset for the next work. The rule also protected distribution. Conversation slowed hands. A man holding the bean bowl while finishing a story created an empty plate farther down the table. In silence, dishes kept moving. And the cook controlled the room. Arguments, card stories, and complaints could wait outside. Inside, the meal had a single purpose. There was a hard edge to this efficiency. Slow eaters could end hungry. Men developed the habit of eating fast because the workday allowed little softness. But from the cook's side of the door, silence turned a noisy crowd into a timed service. It let a small crew feed a large one and recover the room before the next round of baking, washing, and chopping began. Number 5. The bell controlled more than hunger. Loggers told time by meals. Stories happened just before first lunch or just after supper because the cookhouse divided the winter day into dependable sections. That made the meal bell one of the camp's most important instruments. Ring early, and men arrived before food was ready. Ring late, and teams, sawyers, and haulers lost working light. The cook's schedule had to connect oven time to horse time, trail time, and daylight. The bell also synchronized serving. Coffee was filled, bread was cut, hot pans came out, flunkies took position, then the sound crossed camp and the room filled. Without that single signal, men would drift in individually, demanding that food remain at its best for an hour. Predictability helped the kitchen plan quantities. 100 men arriving together sounds difficult, but it is easier than never knowing whether 10 or 50 are about to enter. The cook could build one wave and release it on command. In a camp without electric clocks hanging in every building, the bell was a shared clock and the cook was the man holding its hands. Number 4. The menu was a labor contract. Men could taste. Wages mattered, but food determined whether men stayed. Historical observers repeated the same judgment. The camp with the best meals got the best workers. Quantity was expected. Quality separated one operation from another. That changed how a smart company spent money. Better food was not charity. It reduced the loss of experienced men. A skilled faller who walked out because of raw biscuits cost more than the flour and wages needed to hire a competent cook. Men judged familiar foods mercilessly. Beans had to be seasoned. Roast had to be cooked properly. Bread could not be raw in the center. Experiments were risky. One Oregon cook's crepes and celery dishes angered men who wanted recognizable food, though they happily accepted his chocolate soufflé as swell pudding. The trick was improvement without alienation. A cook gave variety through trusted ingredients. He did not make hungry men decode their plate before a 12-hour day. Number 3. Waste was turned back into supply. Some camps kept hogs near the cookhouse. Scraps fed the animals. The animals eventually fed the camp. It was an early closed loop, though nobody used that polished phrase. The practice reduced garbage in a place with no municipal collection and recovered food energy that would otherwise rot beside the building. It also created a rough measure of kitchen quality. An old story said a job seeker looked at the hogs first. If they were too fat, men must be leaving too much food on their plates, and that suggested a bad cook. Not every camp was clean. Historical reports describe flies, refuse, and unsanitary conditions around some cookhouses. We should not romanticize them. The useful idea was separation and movement. Edible scraps to animal feed where appropriate, grease handled deliberately, ash removed, spoiled food isolated, and dishwater carried away from clean stores. At a scale of hundreds of meals, yesterday's scraps could become today's infestation. A cookhouse that failed at waste management eventually failed at food. The best camp cooks understood a truth modern kitchens still live by. The meal is not finished when the plate leaves the table. It is finished when the remains are safely accounted for. Number 2. The cook controlled the cookhouse like a foreman. Outside meal hours, many camps treated the cookhouse as restricted ground. Men did not wander through looking for snacks, lifting lids, or helping themselves to tomorrow's bread. The boss, clerk, and a few necessary visitors might enter. Everyone else waited for the bell. That rule protected more than the cook's temper. It protected quantities. A missing pie meant a table short at supper. A handful taken from soaking fruit changed a batch. A door left open could chill rising dough. Muddy boots carried the woods into the food room. The cook also needed authority over his assistants and diners. Historical records repeatedly place him just below the foreman in importance. His wages could exceed those of teamsters, blacksmiths, and other skilled men. A boss stepped carefully around a cook with a strong reputation because the entire crew might follow him to another camp. Bad cooks were warned in the language of the woods. Men reportedly nailed failed hotcakes to a cook's door or threw his biscuits at animals. Good cooks had companies boasting their names when recruiting labor. The kitchen ran because responsibility was matched with power. The man blamed for every plate was allowed to control the room that produced it. Number 1. The real trick was that food ran the entire camp. Here is the part most people miss. Those men did not cut timber first and eat when convenient. They ate so they could cut timber at all. Historical estimates put some logging diets above 7,000 calories a day. The number varied by era, region, and job, but the reason is plain. Men swung axes, pulled saws, handled chains, drove teams, and moved through deep snow for 10 or 12 hours. Cold demanded more. Wet clothing demanded more. A meal that would overwhelm a modern office worker could disappear into a faller before daylight and be burned in the woods by noon. So the cook did not support the operation from its edge. He powered it from the center. Every trick we have covered served that one purpose. Night preparation protected the morning. The fire created several temperatures at once. Assistance divided labor. The room shortened movement. Grain changed forms. Syrup delivered quick energy. Leftovers became hash. Preserved meat protected against storms. Dried fruit traveled across seasons. The oven stayed loaded. Beans borrowed time. Sleds carried the cookhouse into the cut. Silence moved dishes. The bell synchronized men. Authority protected the system. That is how one cookhouse could feed 100 men in weather cold enough to stop modern machinery. Not with a magical stove, not with a secret pancake recipe, and not with one heroic cook working alone. It was preparation, repetition, heat management, durable food, disciplined helpers, and a room arranged so nothing moved farther than necessary. It was a factory built from barrels, iron, wood fire, and human memory. And if the cook did his work perfectly, almost nobody noticed the system. The men entered, the platters moved, coffee steamed, bread vanished. 8 minutes later, the benches were empty, and the forest swallowed the crew again. Only the cookhouse remained awake, washing, chopping, rising, simmering, and preparing to do the impossible one more time before the next bell.